Good morning, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining today's Feeding Ourselves Thirsty webinar presented by Ceres Water Program. I'm Kirsten James, the director of the Water Program, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. A few logistics before we begin. All the lines will be on mute. However, there is an opportunity to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. You should be able to see a chat feature, which is shown here in a graphic, the interface, and you can type your questions in this interface, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentations. And of note, the session will be recorded, and we'll be sharing a link afterwards as well. So we have a really great lineup of speakers and perspectives today. So I'd like to take just a quick moment to introduce our fabulous speakers. So first we have Ian Knight. Ian is the Global Sustainability Senior Manager with Mars Incorporated. He's based in the UK and works in the Mars Corporate Sustainability team, where he covers supply chain water stewardship and the operational sustainability of the global factory network. Ian is a chemical engineer by training and has held various engineering and sustainability leadership roles within Mars over a 30-year period. Next, we're joined by Julie Gordy. Julie is the Senior Vice President for Sustainable Investing at Impact Asset Management, LLC, and Pax World Funds. She oversees environmental, social, and governance-related research on prospective and current investments, as well as the firm's shareholder engagement and public policy advocacy. Julie is also a member of the Impact's Gender Analytics team. And finally, my colleague Jacob London, who is a senior associate on Ceres Water team and a co-author of Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. Jacob works with institutional investors to improve their understanding of the financial risks associated with global water stress, and he also coordinates shareholder engagements with the food industry focused on water and climate risks. So I'll take a quick moment to set the stage for the conversation, and then we'll turn it over to our speakers. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Ceres, for the past 30 years, we have worked with companies, investors, policymakers, and other partners to drive sustainable solutions throughout the economy. As a sustainability nonprofit advocacy organization, we pursue this mission through 4 extensive networks, which you can see here on the slide. We have our company network, our investor network, our policy network, and our nonprofit network. And our work on water resources really runs through all of these networks, including the Investor Water Hub, which is a 115 institutional investors strong working group of the investor network, and Connect the Drops, which is a water public policy initiative in the policy and water teams. I'm really excited to see that many of our partners from all of these networks are joining us today for this discussion. And of course, if you're interested in hearing more about any of these networks, please do reach out to us. Next slide, please. So Ceres focuses on the world's biggest sustainability challenges, including climate change, inequitable workplaces, and the topic that we're focusing on today, water scarcity and pollution. The water team engages with and provides research, thought leadership, and guidance to key players in the economy, including investors, large companies, and their suppliers, to make the business case for managing water risks. And really, we believe that companies who steward water will be more resilient, and investors who hold these companies will mitigate water risk and have opportunity to get ahead of the curve. Next slide, please. The central topic of today's discussion, our recently released Feeding Ourselves Thirsty benchmarking report, and the perspectives you'll hear from a corporate partner and an investor partner really are the perfect example of this theory of change. So we hope from today's session, you'll leave with a better understanding of how food and beverage companies are managing water and the trends over the last 6 years. Also, we hope you'll discover just different corporate investor perspectives on the analysis, how it can be utilized as an important tool, and opportunities for food and beverage companies to really create and get on the path towards a water smart future. And lastly, we hope you'll leave with some ideas on ways to utilize the report and also ways just to engage around this work and our water work and Ceres more generally. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jacob London, who will kick us off by providing an overview of the report and dive into some of the main findings. Jacob?
Thanks, Kirsten. I'm excited to tell everyone a little bit more about how we derived the report today and dive into the key findings. So this is the third edition of Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, which scores and benchmarks the water risk management of about 40 food companies based primarily in the US. We conducted the first edition of this analysis in 2015 and followed up the study in 2017 as well. We analyzed 4 industries: agricultural products, beverages, consumer packaged goods, and meat processors, and scored them on a 0 to 100 point basis based on their public disclosures against the following categories. So first we look at how the extent to which corporate boards and senior executives are tasked with overseeing water risks and how these executives are incentivized to manage water risks. We also look at how companies handle risks to their direct operations, the facilities they own, in looking at the strength of water risk assessments, the quality and scope of water use targets, and any standards that companies have for managing water discharge and water quality from their facilities. But most of the emphasis is on the manufacturing and agricultural supply chain and what companies are doing in this stage of their value chain, because this is really where the bulk of both companies' footprints lie in terms of water use and water quality, and also where they're really exposed to financial risk associated with water stress. And so here we're looking at, again, the quality of companies' risk assessments and the strength of sustainable sourcing strategies and companies' efforts to support change at a field level and farmers' transitions to more sustainable agricultural practices. And just a quick note on the data. We really didn't want to add to the reporting burden of these companies, so we didn't solicit information from these companies. We used what was out there already, be it voluntary disclosures such as CDP reports or company websites, or CDP water, climate, and forest reports, or mandatory financial disclosures as well, such as annual reports and proxy statements. So how do companies do? Here we're looking at the scores of all 40 companies with the top 20 on the left and the bottom 20 on the right. And when interpreting these scores, I keep in mind that these scores between 0 and 100 are an approximation of what we view as the strength of a company's water risk management. We didn't assess risk exposure in this analysis. So even though a company may score highly, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're less exposed to these risks, rather that they're just being more proactive about addressing them. And so a few high-level findings. The average score this year was 38 out of 100 points. So companies still have plenty of room to improve. But this did amount to a 25% increase in scores from the 2017 analysis. When we look at how industries performed, which are noted by the different colors here, as has been true in the past, we see that packaged food and beverage companies are still leading, and meat and agricultural products companies are lagging. At the same time, agricultural products as an industry on average showed the most improvement of any of the 4 industries since 2017, which just indicates how the meat industry is lagging even further behind its peers, which is notable given the water intensity of raising livestock and the water quality impacts of producing meat. So on the next slide, we'll take a look at a high level what's improved and what's stalled. So we're seeing that corporate boards and senior executives are becoming more aware of these risks and taking steps to formally oversee them. Nearly all the companies now that we analyze have some form of water use or efficiency target, and we're seeing more companies assess water-related risks, not just to their facilities, but to their key agricultural commodities. At the same time, many of these risk assessments still fail to address risks beyond water scarcity, like water quality, biodiversity, and regulatory risks. And when it comes to actions that companies are taking to address risks in their supply chain in particular, we're still seeing a substantial portion of the food industry moving very slowly on setting sustainable sourcing goals and policies and supporting the efforts of farmers in their supply chain to transition to more sustainable practices. So breaking down further into the categories of risk management we look at, we'll start with corporate governance. And we look at this mainly because any efforts or risk management strategies a company has on water and climate are going to have to be approved and driven by boards and senior executives, which head the organization. So good risk management means that boards and senior executives will be tasked with specific oversight over water risk and incentivize against the company's performance objectives. And we did see some meaningful progress along these lines. We see now that 70% of boards in the analysis have formal oversight of sustainability, and a third of the companies we looked at have boards that are regularly briefed not just on sustainability risks, but water risks specifically, and that's up from just 10% of companies in 2015. And ideally, what strong oversight and management structures will lead to is companies incorporating water risks into major business decisions like acquisitions, capital investments, the siting of facilities, and contracts with major suppliers. One example of a company that does that really well is Ingredion, an agricultural products company based in the US, who now formally integrates climate and water risks into its due diligence for potential acquisitions. The company noted that this process has influenced acquisition decisions, and they think it provides them with a strategic advantage over their industry peers. Group Danone identifies their chief procurement officer as the highest level management position that has direct responsibility for the company's water strategy. And they also specify that the chief procurement officer reports directly to the chief financial officer, which is really transparent and helps investors gain a clear picture of who exactly is overseeing these risks on a day-to-day basis. And finally, when it comes to incentivizing companies, we're seeing only a handful of companies link the compensation of executives to water goals. More are linking them to climate or sustainability goals more broadly. But companies are doing this. Leading companies are doing this. Molson Coors, for example, incentivizes executives, including their CEO, their chief operating officer, and their chief procurement officer, against the company's performance on its greenhouse gas reduction and water efficiency targets. So once a company has established these governance structures, a really foundational step is conducting a water risk assessment, which can help companies identify the types of risks they're exposed to and where those risks are most severe. And this is something that is relatively low cost and low effort for companies to undertake, as tools from organizations like the World Wildlife Fund, the World Resources Institute, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development really allow companies to plug and play with their operations and supply chains and see where high-risk hotspots may be with relatively low effort. But we're still seeing a good chunk of these companies not really doing this, and companies that are analyzing risks aren't necessarily always going beyond water scarcity and soliciting input from a diverse array of stakeholders, including regulators, their customers, suppliers, or local water users. Two companies who do this really well are General Mills and Diageo. General Mills looks at 15 of its priority commodities in 36 sourcing regions using the WRI Aqueduct tool, the water risk filter from WWF. And they then disclose how this analysis informs where they focus their efforts in the supply chain, which is really key to take it beyond just an assessment of risks to using the analysis to hone in on the high-risk areas. Similarly, Diageo also uses several of these tools and models the impact of different warming scenarios from the IPCC on barley growing regions, which is a really significant commodity for them. And when we look at again how these companies are doing, we are seeing an uptick in the number of companies that are looking at supply chain risks, but there's a wide range in the quality and scope of these risk assessments. So there's certainly an opportunity for companies to go deeper in terms of the factors that they're considering in their analyses. When it comes to water use targets, we're seeing that there's it's basically an industry standard now to have some form of water use or water efficiency target. 90% of companies now have one. Only 4 lack any sort of water use target out of 40. But at the same time, there's really an opportunity here for this group of 26 companies who have a generic target across their operations that isn't differentiated by geography. In other words, these targets don't call for more aggressive reductions of water use in areas that are more water stressed. And so this is an area where companies have already put in work to measure their water use and set these targets, but can really take it further in terms of ensuring that targets are again more aggressive in areas that need it most. Mars, as we'll hear more from Ian later on the call, is already doing some great work in this area. And another example worth highlighting is PepsiCo, which has its own water use efficiency goal across its operations, but it also has water efficiency goals specifically for its high-risk agricultural commodities, which is not something we're seeing from the majority of these companies. And finally, when we start to look at the supply chain, we put a lot of emphasis on this just because, again, this is where the vast majority of companies' footprints come from, both in terms of water use and water pollution. So committing to procure commodities from more sustainable sources is a key step for companies looking to reduce their water footprints. At the same time, though, this isn't just about reducing water footprints. These companies rely on a steady supply of agricultural commodities, and agricultural practices that improve soil health will help keep water in the soil, make soil less likely to erode, and reduce farmers' input costs through reducing the need for irrigation and fertilizer inputs. So these really help to fortify company supply chains and make them more resilient to extremes in participation. At the industry level, we still see about 30% of companies lack any sort of goals. And the existing commitments we see lack clear definitions or measurements of progress and are often very vague when it comes to defining exactly what sustainable sourcing means. And so just a couple examples here of companies that are really leading in this area. So Kellogg's, through its risk assessment, identified 10 priority ingredients and discloses the third-party metrics and tools it uses to measure continuous improvement of its sustainable sourcing goals, and it regularly publicly discloses progress to its key stakeholders. And then Unilever and PepsiCo, although they have their own sustainable sourcing goals and strategies, provide good examples of companies that are really going further and incentivizing growers at the field level to implement these practices. They do this through a per acre premium on cover crops that they provide to Iowa corn and soy farmers, which can really help bridge the gap between high upfront costs that farmers have in implementing sustainable practices and when they see returns from those practices, which can often take place a few years down the line. And so going forward, I know Kirsten is going to talk a little bit more about how our partners can get more involved in this work, but one opportunity that's a little more time sensitive that I wanted to share was regarding a sign-on letter that Ceres and the UK Investor Coalition FAIR have coordinated amongst right now a coalition of 80 investors with over $6.5 trillion in combined assets, calling on 6 of the largest fast food companies to pay more attention to the water and climate impacts of their animal protein supply chains. So we'll hear a little bit more about this on the call, but if you're an investor and you have any questions about what this engagement might involve, or how to get more involved, feel free to let us know after the webinar. And KJ, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Jacob, for that overview. And of course, everyone can access the full report on Ceres' website and dive in even deeper. And then just to everyone, as a reminder, if you have questions for Jacob or along the way, please remember to input your questions into the webinar interface, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the discussion. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Ian, who, as a reminder, represents Mars. And I'll just note they are one of the benchmark companies in the report, and also have the honor of being the most improved in this year's benchmarking report. So Ian, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Well, it's great to be here, focusing on this hugely important topic. Mars is our international food and pet care business. We're headquartered in the US with more than $35 billion in annual sales. We're a family business with a global network of 420 sites in more than 80 countries. I hope you, and especially your pets, have a favorite Mars product. Mine is our coconut ice cream brand, Bounty, which sadly is not quite popular enough yet to make it onto the photo. But Mars believes it's time to embrace a sense of urgency to tackle climate change and other pressing environmental and societal issues where we have a role to play. We'll have the next slide, please. Whilst it remains important to advance sustainable business practices in our direct operations, the vast majority of our impacts, like water, land, and human rights, happen in our supply chains, particularly in agriculture. We've embraced this sense of urgency by launching our Sustainable Intergeneration Plan, a plan to grow in ways that are good for people, good for the planet, and good for our business. While our direct operations remain important, we're now much more focused on driving positive change at scale through our value chains. The world is facing significant challenges. In addition to climate change, poverty, water stress, and other social and environmental issues are holding us back. And Mars will invest $1 billion to activate the plan over the next few years. So the plan focuses on 3 interconnected ambitions that we believe are essential drivers of sustainable growth. Thriving people, meaningfully improving the working lives of 1 million people in our value chain, mainly smallholder farmers, to enable them to thrive. Nourishing well-being, advancing science, innovation, and marketing in ways that help billions of people and their pets to lead healthier, happier lives. And healthy planet, reducing our environmental impacts in line with what science says is necessary to keep the planet healthy. Water scarcity affects 40% of people globally, and that percentage is rising with population growth. We must factor in the impacts of climate change on the availability of water. In many places, precipitation patterns will alter, not only with more or less rain, but also with changes in the timing and intensity of rainfall that could damage agriculture. So our water work fits within a balanced programme of environmental and societal improvement ambitions, helping ensure we don't make progress in one area at the expense of another. So the next slide, please. Whilst water is essential for factory operations, we know agriculture is by far the biggest user of water in our value chain, which means that to manage water sustainably, we must focus on what's grown at crop level and where it's grown. Many of the materials we buy for our products are heavily irrigated, like rice, mint, almonds, and grow in water-stressed locations like Spain, India, Pakistan, and the Western United States. When we mapped our unsustainable water use, we found that more than 99% was in agriculture. So that's where we focus most. So next slide. Knowing the importance of agricultural water use to Mars, and the Chinese proverb that says that not only can water float a boat, but also sink it, we very much welcome Ceres' work on water use in the food industry, highlighting its importance, identifying practical actions that businesses can take to address water risks, and assisting companies like Mars as they design their water programs. And we at Mars especially value our critical friends. Praise from a friend who is well informed and understands the challenges you face but who is also willing to tell you when you need to improve or where you were going wrong, is all the more valuable. The next slide. So in my remaining time, I'm going to look in a bit more detail at some of the nuts and bolts of our water program and some particular sort of insights and learnings. So next slide. We see meaningful quantitative targets based on science and is designed to ensure Mars reduces its impacts in accordance with its fair share of the problems that the globe and communities face as being absolutely vital. Complementing a 2-degree climate target and a land area target, we aim to eliminate our unsustainable water use in the long term and halve it in the short term. Next slide. This water target is context-based. We've mapped our water withdrawals by location. Most of our water use is sustainable, but where our suppliers irrigate crops in water-stressed locations, we target to reduce our absolute water usage in proportion to the stress level in the location, targeting greater reductions in areas of the greatest stress. So these are context-based targets. Our approach is detailed in our water position statement that you can find on mars.com. And we believe that this approach needs more widespread adoption if we're to fix water stress. Next slide. So this gentleman you can see here, Barry Parkin, is Mars Chief Sustainability Officer. He worked with our owners, the board, and external stakeholders to develop the Sustainable Intergeneration Plan. The interesting thing is that Barry was then put in charge of the procurement function after the plan was adopted, recognizing the key role that procurement has to play to deploy improvement programs through the supply chain to achieve our targets. As we move from our historical approach of treating our raw materials as commodities towards a much greater level of understanding and control of the purchasing process and the sustainable practices of our suppliers, even down to farm level, this is a significant development for us. The next slide. 1/4 of all the water withdrawn by humanity is for rice irrigation. It's the daily staple of 3.5 billion people. Production needs to expand by 25% in the next 25 years to feed a growing global population. But rice farmers are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change. Rising sea levels, drought and flooding, salinity, rising temperatures. As a business, we want to help solve these challenges, especially as more than 50% of Mars' unsustainable water use is for rice irrigation. Our first step towards creating a more sustainable rice supply chain was to work in partnership through collaboration with WWF, the UN Environment, and the International Rice Research Institute. We were able to launch the world's first sustainability rice standard under the banner of the Sustainable Rice Platform. Working in partnership with our suppliers and rice farmers around the world, we're now pushing to ensure that all Uncle Ben's rice that we source is produced in line with Sustainable Rice Platform standards, alongside focused intervention programs that make a real difference beyond just compliance. In India and Pakistan, we've worked with approximately 2,000 basmati rice farmers to improve farmer education and income, increase crop yields and reduce water use. Working in partnership with the Swiss Development Agency and Helvetus on a program called WAPRO, Water Productivity. These farmers are learning new techniques to improve water efficiency, reduce and safely manage their use of fertilizers and pesticides, and improve the health and safety of farm workers. We're already seeing impressive results. For example, in Pakistan, we've seen a 32% in farmer income, a 17% increase in yield, and a 30% reduction in water use among farmers who've adopted more sustainable growing methods. These results cover a 3-year period and are being monitored every year going forward. With demand for rice growing, and as a manufacturer of some of the world's favourite rice brands, it makes sense that Mars Food is at the forefront of developing and implementing new rice farming practices. To the next slide. Moving to our learnings. Water is a classic think global, act local challenge, and we continue to work to understand our supply chain, realizing the importance of knowing exactly where crops are growing and what water is available in that location. We've come to see the use of a global information system as essential to bring together location-specific information and data on water, to bring together crop per ton water usage information, and to calculate our overall impact for the tons purchased. We've also seen the need to work holistically when working with smallholder farmers in developing countries like in India, designing programs that particularly address income level as well as your water use in tandem are much more effective. Challenges we face, well, our increasing use of almonds, largely sourced from the Central Valley, driven by consumer demand for products like Kind, where we hold the manufacturing rights outside of the US, and for products like almonds, M&Ms. And a second challenge, where sustainable agricultural techniques are insufficient to fix problems, like in Haryana state in India, where rice cultivation is happening for us for basmati rice, but where groundwater levels are rapidly falling. And then finally, Kirsten asked me to talk about some of the exciting things we're doing. So we're bringing our targets on next slide, please. We're particularly kind of bringing our targets to life in our procurement department. So knowing that supply chain intervention programs take time to develop and to implement, and that there may be a significant lag before the program starts to deliver reduced impacts. So to recognize this and to help ensure that our procurement function are on track, we've developed a leading KPI to ensure we're making sufficient progress. We see outside value chain offset projects as the only way to deliver our target in some locations, and we're working with the Livelihoods Development Fund for family farming to investigate projects that can work to do this. We continue to invest in data and improving our understanding of issues at local level to ensure we've got a holistic understanding to inform our strategic thinking. And the final point here is around including water in brand messaging and using our work on water sustainability to connect with consumers and customers as a way of building brand value and sales, which is obviously attractive to us as a consumer goods company. And it's a promotion that German cash and carry Metro have run for the last 3 years involving some of our brands that shows what's possible to build sales, but also to bring these water issues to the fore with their customers. So, and I think it would be very helpful if more retailers ran more water-centered promotions, helping to advance water stewardship in the food industry generally. So I look forward to your questions later. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Ian. It's really wonderful to hear about all the cutting edge work that Mars is undertaking, and I think really can serve as a model for many of your peers. So thank you for that. And next up, I'll turn it over to Julie Gordy.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ian, for making me feel a whole lot better about my multi-decadal dependence on M&Ms. We really thank Ceres for its invaluable work. At PAX, we specialize in sustainable investing, and that job is significantly better informed because of the work that Ceres does, like this work on water risk management by the largest food companies. Food and water are both necessities of life, and the very stability of our society and global economy depend on them. We can't afford a system in which one compromises the other. I will spare you the rest of the commercial, and we'll move to the next slide. So our existing economy is a depleted one. It's based on extracting resources from our planet and turning them into goods and services, often with what we economists call negative externalities that either aren't priced or aren't realistically priced by markets. How depleted? In terms of our use of supposedly renewable resources, we surpassed the Earth's long-term carrying capacity in 1987. At that point, the population was 5 billion. At this point, we've got more than 7.5 billion people on the planet. In the past, we've always depended on technology to stretch our resources. And that's about as close as we will ever get, probably, to having fairy dust. But that capacity isn't infinite, even if there weren't externalities. If it were, we'd be able to grow all the world's food in a flower pot just by adding more labor and capital to it. What we really need is an economy that's more sustainable, and that's based on our being able to provide for human needs without the compromising the ability of future generations to do the same thing, and without compromising the well-being of life of all of Earth's other species. Getting smarter about water is one of the things we need to learn how to do. Next. So let's take just climate change as an example, because climate and water are inextricably, that is a really hard word to say, are linked at the hip with each other, both in terms of risks and opportunities. The technology that got us into the mess we're in now with greenhouse gases is largely because it's one of the consequences of the development of technology throughout human history. When we started replacing human labor and horsepower, real horses, with oil, gas, and coal, we had no idea that we were changing the climate, but now we do know. We have already warmed the Earth by more than 1 degree Celsius, and while that may not sound like much, consider that when there were dinosaurs doing one of the two things that dinosaurs apparently did, ruling and roaming the Earth, the temperature was about 5 degrees to 8 degrees higher than it is now, and sea levels were between 150 and 250 meters higher than they are now. So every degree makes a big difference. How do we deal with climate change? We have two paths, and we will have to go down both of them. We must manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. What does avoiding the unmanageable mean? We have to reduce emissions essentially to zero by the middle of the century to avoid warming the Earth by more than 2 degrees from where we are now. We call that mitigation, and water technologies can really help contribute to mitigation. Managing the unavoidable means that warming will happen. We have another degree locked in, even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases in the next 10 minutes. Both of those create risks and opportunities, and I could riff on those for days. But for now, I'll leave it there and assure you that I can provide endless examples. Next slide, please. So one of the big deals about climate is the physical impacts. And we see that companies are already starting to manage them, even though there aren't, even though there are still way too many companies that don't see those risks coming. We could do a whole nother webinar on what the health sector should expect, for example, as the map of diseases and pests expands from the tropics to the temperate zones. For food and beverage companies, which are included in the consumer staples sector, there's a fair awareness of those risks, even though there are around 15% of companies that look like they're heading for the land of surprises. What might surprise everyone is how fast these things are coming. Everyone seems to think they're at least a few years off. They're not, they're here now. Next slide. So this map, which is from Carbon Brief, includes all types of events, but it's really noteworthy how many of them include water. These are a map of the events that have been attributed to climate change over the past few years. Some of these involve too much water, drought, yes, drought is too much water. Some of them involve the quantity of water, and that's drought, sea level rise, rain and flooding, river flow, and storms for certain, and probably also including many of the events that are labeled cold, snow and ice, ecosystem function, and wildfire. For example, the increasing risk of catastrophic fire in California and really throughout the Intermountain West, as Ian noted, is very much related to drought. Anytime you have the combination of increasing temperature, increasing drought, and rising population, you're going to have mushrooming fire risk. California is a poster child for that at the moment, but it won't be the only one. The takeaway here is that we're already experiencing the impact of climate change and its impact on water in material ways, whether it's too much, too little, wrong timing, poor quality. By the way, this map is interactive, and you can find it at Carbon Brief if you want to explore it in greater detail. Next slide. So, yeah, we think of the Earth as a water planet, and in many ways it really is. But in terms of the water that most suits human needs, we're living off a teeny proportion of it. Of all the water on Earth, not counting the water bound up in the rocks in the mantle, the vast majority is saline. And while that's an important habitat, the water we need for drinking and hygiene and agriculture and industrial use is fresh water. 3.5% of the world's surface fresh water is ice. Of that 3.5, most of it is ice, 70% of it. And most of that is in Antarctica. About 31% of fresh water is liquid, and that includes rivers and lakes, which are our main sources. So what are the risks associated with water? Simply put, quality and quantity. Too much water. Climate change is driving changes in water quantity, and sometimes that means too much, otherwise known as flooding. Prime among the factors behind the increasing flood risk in many places is climate change. Some places will get more, some will get less, some will get more intense precipitation. The U.S. National Climate Assessment notes that there have been large increases in heavy precipitation in the Northeast, Midwest, and Great Plains, in the largest rivers, including the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi, and the number of days with high stream flow has been rising over the past 3 decades. Land use is also a culprit. The more land we develop, the less our landscape is able to accommodate heavy rainfall. Too little water is another risk, and there are many places that already face climate drought. I've already mentioned California, but that's just one example. And climate change does simultaneously drive increases in droughts and floods. It just depends on where you are as to which of those risks that you face the most. Quality is another factor we can't ignore. The water we need has to be pretty pure, and a lot of the things we do with it make that harder to accomplish. It is common for water used in agriculture, mining, and industry to be contaminated by those uses, and if it's not cleaned up sufficiently, we can have major problems. Think about Flint, Michigan. Our water infrastructure is also a problem, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's clear from all of these that there are major risks facing us in the water area, and every single one of them also presents an opportunity for someone. Next slide. So, lots of ways to look at water risks and opportunities from an investment perspective. This is just an example of a few of the ways we look at it. Water infrastructure, sometimes it feels like there's a rule that says the term infrastructure must be preceded by the adjective aging. We do have an aging infrastructure, and failures in existing infrastructures can affect everyone. The more water intensive an operation is, the greater the potential for significant impact. If you're a semiconductor plant, you can't afford to rely on an unreliable infrastructure. The American Society for Civil Engineers Infrastructure Report Card gives the U.S. water and wastewater systems a D and D+ respectively. We're not in good shape. Replacement of that infrastructure can either kick the can down the road or build a better mousetrap. I should note that I'm a crazed fan of mixed metaphors like that one. Whatever the choice, one of the opportunities is in diagnosing the most crucial needs for replacement or repair before the problems manifest, which means major opportunities to provide better technologies for things like acoustic monitoring and pressure management. Water and wastewater management is also something that presents risks and opportunities. Anything that makes purification and filtration easier, faster, and more effective could be an investment opportunity, depending, of course, on the economics. When we talk about utilities, also, we don't just mean water utilities. Obviously, they face huge risks and opportunities, but we and they have the aging infrastructure and infrastructure maintenance issues, but electric utilities also have a stone to bring to the edifice. Some existing electricity production methods are far more water intensive than we ever give them credit for, and that includes all thermal plants, coal, nuclear, and natural gas. It's not just water intensity that presents risk for them, by the way. For nuclear plants, water temperature is also crucial, and cooling water cannot exceed its specified temperature. The plant must be shut down, and if that happens, it wrecks your entire day if you're a utility operator, nuclear plant operator, and it's already happened several times. Pollution control is a rich field of opportunities because water pollution represents a rich ecosystem of risks. We see opportunities in pollution prevention, efficient pollution control technologies, and a lot of opportunities in testing and sensing technologies. The big kahuna is recycling and processing, obviously, for the globe. China has recently declined to continue being the world's plastic disposal solution, and while some other countries have picked up the slack, like Thailand, that's a finite and limited solution. We need to find ways to reduce plastic pollution or truly recycle plastic in ways that aren't being done right now. Next slide. Just to talk briefly about engaging on climate change. This, for an investor, one of the things we do besides construct portfolios is engage with portfolio companies. And that's one of the main tools that we have actually to address a lot of these risks. We and several other investors vote our proxies in line with sustainability aims of our funds, which means that we generally vote for proposals, which usually but not always come from shareholders, that asks for companies to assess sustainability risks like climate change or water availability or pollution. For water specifically, there's a really good piece actually on the Ceres website about trends in water-related U.S. shareholder proposals, noting that there were 338 resolutions focused on water between 2004 and 2017. So it's happening. We're also members of several collaborative engagements like the ones listed here, CDP, et cetera. And then we're involved in several collaborative engagements that focus on climate but include water, like our engagement now with companies that have supply chains that depend on Brazil, and we are aiming for commitments to avoid deforestation, which affects both climate and water. Next slide. So critical steps in risk mitigation. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I think you already heard a lot of this from Jacob. Obviously, companies need to focus on governance, establishing priorities, and then providing incentives for those priorities. You need to do a materiality analysis that should include the value chain risks, and there should be board oversight. And I don't mean just board oversight when there's a catastrophe, but all the time, perennial, routine. Establishing priorities, Ian gave some really great examples of how that's done. So did Jacob, about companies that do provide sustainable sourcing goals. And just from an investor's perspective, I will just say it's vastly much more useful for investors to see a quantitative commitment that has both a target that's quantitative, like reducing water use by 20% by X date, and time bound as well. And technology is, is specifying or at least outlining the kinds of technology development that need to be implemented in order to achieve those priorities is very useful. And finally, we also heard a little bit about executive comp and how that can be linked to these targets. It's not done very much right now, but we really appreciate it when it is. Final slide for me. So the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty is a really useful report for investors. It can help you identify risks, opportunities, and engagement possibilities, and give lots of insight into what the specific engagement opportunities are company by company. Thank you for having me on this webinar. I really appreciated it, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, for those insights. It's really interesting to hear how you guys are, your approach to mitigating water risks and how you're capturing opportunities and how you're engaging. So really appreciate those insights. Next slide, please. So how can you all engage? Well, there's many different opportunities coming up in the water realm. Just a few listed here. So first off, we'd be happy for company investors on the line to do more in-depth briefings to really ensure that you're maximizing your use of this report as an important tool. So that's definitely something we'd be happy to do. Also, as Jacob highlighted, we have an ongoing global investor engagement on meat sourcing. And so this engagement is asking quick service restaurant companies to set and report on clear strategies for how they're de-risking their meat and dairy supply chains. So definitely a really important effort that links very strongly to a lot of the findings in this report. So thank you to those who are already active in this effort, and we really would welcome others. So please join us for that. Also, many opportunities to join the various Ceres networks that are involved in water. So as I mentioned already, the Ceres Investor Water Hub, which is a working group of the investor network. And this group really is undertaking activities that help drive greater consideration of water and investment decision making. So among other work, this group offers peer-to-peer sharing of leading practices. It's a collective action forum really dedicated to developing more effective research methods on how to assess water risks and opportunities. So a lot going on there, and we'd welcome your participation in that. Also, Ceres Company Network does a lot of direct stakeholder engagements around water resources. So that's another opportunity to engage with us from the corporate side. And then Connect the Drops, which is our public policy advocacy initiative in California. A real great opportunity to engage in public policy that can really help drive smart water management. And also stay tuned to future research that we're putting out. We expect a new study in the early 2020 on sustainable sourcing commitments. So that's definitely something else to look out for as well. We have had many questions coming in, and do have some time to get to some of those. If we don't get to all of your questions, apologies, and please do reach out to us, and we can get those answered. But we'll try to get to as many as we can. So let's see, the first one that's coming in, I think, Ian, I'll send your way. So you and I have had many discussions on California, since that's where I'm based and have done much work, and you obviously have a footprint here. So the question is, what efforts are underway or proposed for correcting and protecting the ecological imbalance in sensitive areas like the Central Valley of California or other spots where you've designated as high risk?
Well, we think that primarily our target will act as a North Star to move us in the right direction. I mean, we particularly focus on water balance because we believe that is the area where we can make the greatest contribution. So in the longer term, our target will guide our programs, and in the shorter term, we're really working to understand what we need to do on a commodity like almonds. So I was in the Central Valley in the summer with a number of other people from Mars, and we were talking to growers, we were talking to the almond board, we've been talking to NGOs to help us to craft a sustainable almond sourcing strategy. And we're also very interested in to see how Sigma kind of plays out, impacting the industry. And we, like a lot of others, are very hopeful that will make a significant difference.
Great, thanks. And for those of you who aren't familiar with SGMA, that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was adopted in California back in 2014. And the first sustainability plans are going to be coming out in January. So definitely a lot of eyes on those, really ensuring our groundwater supplies in California are back in balance. Great, well, thank you for that. So Julie, turning to you, you went into this a bit at the end of your presentation, but can you provide a little bit more color on what role investors play in working with their portfolio companies to improve water stewardship?
So a lot of the role that investors really play with individual companies is engagement. So talking to companies about what they're doing, suggesting solutions to them, which can sometimes be done through just plain old engagement, and other times is done with the help of shareholder proposals, is one of the main ways that we interact with companies. And what we actually do with the companies, if you look at that piece of the Ceres website that I mentioned that notes what the water-related resolutions have been, you'll note that there are several varieties of them. And that's just because there's many ways that we touch the elephant of water. So some of us are more concerned about the quality of water. With some companies, it's more about the quantity of withdrawals or the type of treatment they're using. So a lot of engagement is very company specific, just like through the Ceres company network or through some of these multi-investor or even individual investor engagements with companies. The other thing I should mention, though, is that the kind of information that we get from Feeding Ourselves Thirsty also helps us with portfolio construction. Increasingly, a lot of investors are using the sort of not just exposure to risk, but what companies are doing to manage the risks and take advantage of opportunities to determine both the presence of a company in the portfolio and the weight. So sometimes companies or investors will underweight companies that are not managing those risks as well, or overweight companies that are managing them better, or just avoid them altogether if they don't think that they're doing enough, or if they present too high a risk profile. We're increasingly seeing the risk of catastrophic events manifest themselves in portfolios, and we're seeing that, over like a decade of time, that could actually affect company value by, double digits in terms of the % of earnings foregone, if you're not managing those potential for catastrophic risks well enough. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Julie. That's really insightful. Let's see, another one for Ian came in. So Ian, this question focuses on sort of, the consumers that really, more and more so want to buy products from leading edge companies on ESG issues. So, given that, and all Mars's work on water stewardship, have you done more targeted communications or marketing PR to really highlight these efforts and hopefully inspire others to do more?
Yes, we have. I mean, particularly on rice, where we've been working on rice on water use in rice for a long time, and probably our messaging there is at its most advanced, but also with mint. I think one of the challenges that we face is really kind of educating the consumer, and to understand some of the issues. Like I think some of the messaging around agricultural water use and why it's important, and what can be done. It takes a long sort of time. There isn't a sort of like a soundbite that really gets it across and why it's important. I think the consumer on water tends to resonate more with WASH, sort of sanitation and hygiene type of projects, more than sort of agricultural water use. And I think that's a challenge. And certainly the Metro promotion I mentioned, its banner was a WASH related project. That was its sort of banner sort of messaging was around that. And then those of brands who were doing things more in their value chain were sort of blending their messages in with it. But I think at the moment, I think only sort of water and sanitation based messaging is kind of able to land.
Great, thank you. So the next one I'll send over to Jacob, and then Julie, if you have any thoughts as well. Which company or companies really need the most work from shareholders? Jacob?
Sure. I mean, so what we found in our analysis is that the meat industry is doing the least to manage the water risks it's exposed to and reduce its impacts, while at the same time it's particularly vulnerable to these risks just due to the immense amount of water it takes to feed and raise livestock, and also because the industry is driving really severe and widespread impacts on water quality around the world. Through subpar manure management, discharges from slaughtering houses, and various regulatory compliance issues, and also a big source of nutrient pollution is, of course, runoff from fertilizer runoff from the feed crops that are used to feed livestock. So, these companies are also, their feed supply chains are being hit already and increasingly by drought and flooding around the world. And so there's a strong business case, I think, for investors to push the meat industry to take these risks more seriously and start looking at them more proactively. But a lot of the meat suppliers in particular are, just getting started on sustainability more broadly, not just water specifically. And they can be insulated from consumer and brand risk, given how far up they are in the supply chain, and the fact that folks may not know their names. So I think that's an issue. That's an industry that investors can certainly play a valuable role in pushing them to start addressing these risks more comprehensively.
Great, and all the more reason to join us in our engagement on the quick service restaurants. Julie, any other sort of companies that come to mind from your end?
Yeah, so just a final thought, and that's, well, Jacob's right that there, in terms of direct use and direct impact, meat is one of the hot targets, anything in agriculture or food. But I would also mention financials. They're both investors and banks, have a major role to play in terms of, reducing water risk in their own portfolios, reducing potential stranded assets. If a bank's, somebody that a bank has lent money to ends up defaulting on their loan, the bank can end up owning those assets, and they oftentimes do a really poor job of managing them, even for short periods of time. So I think, and there's a lot of investors who, despite their apparent commitments to sustainability, vote against most or all climate and water related shareholder proposals. And that's, the companies listen to investors. And if investors are sort of saying one thing out of the one side of their mouth and doing another in their proxy voting, that gets heard much more loudly than the public commitments and letters written by chairmen and things like that. So just a final mention.
Yeah, no, important point. Well, we unfortunately are at time, so if you didn't get your question answered, we'd be happy to check in with folks, so please do follow up with us. A really big thank you to our terrific speakers and really sharing their cutting edge work, and for everyone attending today's webinar. I do hope that we will see many of you at our Ceres 2020 conference in New York, March 23rd to 26th. Where we'll be diving in deeper to a lot of this work in the water and food and beverage sectors and much, much more. So we hope to see you there. And thank you so much for attending. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day.